One of the coolest things I've ever had a callback for. I'm like dying. Lady Gaga hydration break. Get your water. Where's your... Ready?
Perhaps Rachel Zegler has just delivered the boldest and most unexpected reaction to what is widely considered one of the greatest misfires in Disney's long history. The highly anticipated remake of Snow White was marketed as a daring, modern reimagining of the studio's very first animated classic, a film that helped launch Disney into legend. Expectations were enormous, both from fans who hoped for a faithful revival and from critics eager to see how the studio would navigate the balance between tradition and contemporary values. Yet when the film finally hit theaters, it landed with a thud that echoed across Hollywood. What was intended to be a proud showcase of diversity, progressiveness, and storytelling innovation instead became a cautionary tale of overreach and miscalculation. Rather than quietly accepting the outcome as most actors in her position might have done, Zegler chose to confront the controversy head-on, stepping into the spotlight with comments that were anything but reserved. Her public statements have fueled an even bigger storm, leaving people questioning whether she is genuinely out of touch with audience sentiment or whether she has simply reached a point where she no longer cares how her words are received. The scale of the disaster is staggering. Reports indicate that Disney poured well over $300 million into this project, a sum that included lavish production budgets, multiple rounds of costly reshoots, and one of the most aggressive marketing campaigns in recent memory. The expectation was that the movie would at least recoup its investment, if not dominate the box office during its run. Instead, it fell flat, failing to even come close to breaking even and forcing Disney to swallow a financial loss that instantly placed Snow White in the infamous category of cinematic catastrophes alongside some of Hollywood's biggest flops. The money lost is one thing, but the reputational damage may be even greater, as the failure called into question Disney's current direction and its ability to handle the legacy of its beloved classics. And yet, as jaw-dropping as the numbers are, what has grabbed the most attention is the story Zegler herself is now promoting in the aftermath. Far from acknowledging any missteps or creative shortcomings, she has repeatedly pointed the finger outward, arguing that politics were largely to blame for the movie's poor reception. In her view, the film was never given a fair chance because of entrenched prejudice and cultural bias working against it from the very beginning. According to Zegler, there is even a quiet majority of moviegoers who actually enjoyed the film but are too hesitant, or perhaps too intimidated, to express their support publicly. This claim has only added fuel to the debate, as it reframes the entire narrative from one of creative failure to one of cultural persecution, placing her at the center of a broader ideological battle. Whether her words are interpreted as courageously defiant or recklessly dismissive, one thing is certain: her response has ensured that the conversation around Snow White will continue long after the credits have rolled. Yes, exactly. According to Rachel Zegler, millions of admirers secretly enjoyed the film but were suppressed from speaking out, almost as if an underground fanbase existed that had been silenced by louder critics and hostile commentators. Her reasoning rests on anecdotes from families and individuals she personally knows, whom she claims genuinely appreciated the movie and understood its intention. To her, these personal experiences serve as evidence that a hidden audience of loyal supporters is out there, just unwilling or unable to voice their opinions publicly. This argument, however, raises eyebrows, because it relies on selective stories rather than measurable indicators, and it presumes that a vast silent majority adored a film that the box office numbers, critical reviews, and audience polls all overwhelmingly rejected. But instead of conceding any creative or commercial shortcomings, Zegler has leaned into this narrative, insisting that the true success of a movie cannot be measured by ticket sales or opening weekend totals but rather by the themes it attempts to deliver. She has suggested that what truly matters is the narrative and its cultural message, not how many people actually sat in theaters to watch it. That position might sound noble in theory, but in practice, it feels detached from reality. After all, the film cost well over $300 million when factoring in production, reshoots, and marketing, and Disney expected it to draw massive crowds. Instead, the turnout was so abysmal that Snow White instantly joined the list of the studio's most infamous flops. To dismiss those numbers entirely is like losing a championship game by a staggering margin and then claiming the scoreboard doesn't matter. Eventually, results have to mean something. Yet Zegler didn't stop there. She went further, turning her criticism toward the source material itself, making it clear that she was never particularly fond of the original 1937 Disney classic, nor the Brothers Grimm fairy tale it was based on. In interviews, she stated outright that the original story was outdated, simplistic, and failed to provide a meaningful role model for women. She criticized Snow White's portrayal as passive, naive, and defined primarily by her beauty, pointing to the famous description of her as the fairest of them all as an antiquated and problematic message. In her view, this concept had to be reimagined for modern times, with Snow White no longer defined by her appearance but instead by her leadership, her independence, and her ability to shape her own destiny. Zegler argued that these changes were deliberate from the start and that the remake's mission was not just to retell a fairy tale but to reshape it into a narrative that reflected contemporary values of equality, empowerment, and diversity. To her, that mission was achieved, regardless of whether audiences turned out to support it. She positioned the film almost as a kind of cultural project, a statement about progress and representation rather than a commercial product meant to entertain. The problem, however, lies not only in these creative choices but in the way she has defended them. Her explanations often sound contradictory, fragmented, or dismissive of legitimate criticism. On one hand, she paints the film as a misunderstood work of art that was unfairly attacked by political bias and cultural backlash. On the other hand, she dismisses its failure at the box office as irrelevant, suggesting that numbers never mattered in the first place. By framing the movie's reception as evidence of prejudice against diversity and inclusion, she positions herself and the project as victims of regressive forces in the culture war. Yet this explanation overlooks a crucial reality. Audiences across the political and cultural spectrum, progressives, conservatives, casual viewers, and longtime Disney fans alike, found the movie underwhelming. Many complained not about diversity or politics but about weak storytelling, inconsistent tone, awkward pacing, and characters that failed to connect emotionally. In trying to reduce the failure to politics alone, Zegler sidesteps the uncomfortable but unavoidable truth that Snow White simply did not resonate with viewers. Her insistence that a vast, silenced fanbase exists, one that truly loved the movie but is too hesitant to admit it, stretches credibility. It creates the impression of denial, as though the overwhelming evidence of poor reception can be erased by invoking a hidden legion of secret admirers. It is an argument that feels more like wishful thinking than a reflection of reality, especially when the film's critical scores, audience ratings, and word-of-mouth feedback paint a remarkably consistent picture of disappointment. To position the movie as a cultural triumph unfairly rejected by society is to ignore the very people it was intended to inspire and entertain. The result is a defense that makes the entire fallout surrounding Snow White seem even more surreal, transforming what was already a historic box office disaster into an ongoing spectacle of denial, deflection, and controversy that keeps the film in the headlines long after it left theaters. Audiences did not reject Snow White because of some grand political conspiracy. They rejected it because it felt cheap, hollow, and stripped of the very qualities that made the original a timeless classic. The film came across as a glossy but empty imitation that deviated too far from the magic and heart of the 1937 version, and most viewers recognized that immediately. This wasn't an attack on progress or an assault on politics, it was simply a poor response to a subpar movie. Yet Rachel Zegler's handling of the backlash only made matters worse. At times, her words radiated a kind of arrogance that audiences found difficult to ignore. She once suggested that moving away from the original content was necessary, framing the criticism as nothing more than the grumbling of people trapped in the past. That attitude gave the impression that anyone who disagreed with the creative choices was simply old-fashioned, incapable of appreciating change. When resistance grew to the overtly political and diversity-focused messaging of the remake, she pushed back by declaring that diversity should always come first and that storytelling and narrative ought to come second. It was a daring, even reckless assertion, one that made many people uncomfortable, not because they opposed diversity but because they understood that movies succeed when the story comes before the messaging, not the other way around. What audiences heard from Zegler wasn't defense, it was attack. She accused critics of being prejudiced, implied that detractors were advancing a regressive agenda, and even framed the film's collapse at the box office as proof that society itself was too narrow-minded to appreciate what she and Disney had created. Such rhetoric didn't come across as courageous, it came across as defensive, dismissive, and deeply out of touch. The result has been devastating for her career. What was once seen as the promising rise of a young actress with major studio backing has, in the span of barely a year, spiraled into a free fall. Hollywood is a town that thrives on perception, and the perception now is that Zegler has become more of a liability than an asset. Studios that once considered her for leading roles are now reluctant to hand her major projects, wary of the controversy and backlash she tends to attract. Instead, her name has been attached to smaller independent productions, the kind of limited release projects that lack the funding or distribution to reach broad audiences. Reports suggest that even her upcoming work, such as collaborations with lesser-known directors like Marissa Toy, struggle to secure proper financing and will likely only appear in select theaters, if at all. For someone who, just a year or two ago, was being touted as Disney's next big star, this represents a precipitous and startling decline. Yet despite all of this, Zegler shows no signs of recalibrating. She continues to make audacious claims, doubling down on her belief that she is right and the rest of the world is wrong, framing herself as a misunderstood truth-teller surrounded by critics who refuse to accept progress. But the more she insists on this narrative, the more isolated she appears, and what might have been remembered as a temporary stumble is instead shaping up to look like the defining fall of a once promising career. The truth is visible to everyone now, and watching it unfold has been like witnessing a slow-motion public unraveling, a career disintegration happening in real time. Most actors, when faced with such overwhelming backlash, would step back, regroup, and rethink their approach, perhaps even retreat from the spotlight until the dust settled. Rachel Zegler, however, has chosen the opposite path, putting everything on the line and drawing even more attention to herself by offering explanations that seem less like defenses and more like reckless provocations. The irony is sharp. The more she speaks, the more damage she does, with each new statement quickly clipped, shared, and memed across social media until the fallout takes on a life of its own. Disney, meanwhile, appears to be pulling away from the chaos, quietly bracing for the inevitable release of Snow White on Disney Plus this summer while trying to minimize further embarrassment. But Zegler refuses to let go, fighting on as though her words might somehow rewrite the public perception of the film, clinging to the idea that it was a misinterpreted work of genius rather than the colossal misfire the world saw it as. She has not merely dismissed her critics, she has run over them repeatedly, escalating her rhetoric with each appearance. Her most recent tirade was not confined to defending her portrayal of Snow White but expanded into a sweeping manifesto in which she declared that the entire film industry ought to reshape itself around her definition of progress. She framed diversity and representation not as valuable elements within a narrative but as the final objective of filmmaking itself, something that should outweigh traditions, source material, and even financial outcomes. The timing could not be more bizarre, as Disney continues to nurse the wounds of the Snow White catastrophe, grappling with investor frustration, damaging internal reports, and a public relations nightmare, while Zegler barrels ahead with a tone-deaf discourse on why she believes the film was successful in every way that supposedly matters. In her view, the box office results are meaningless, a distraction from the true victory of modernizing a character and reworking a story to align with contemporary values, even if audiences never showed up. This attempt to redefine success has baffled observers, because while it might sound noble in the context of a small independent film made on a shoestring budget, Snow White was not an underground art project but a $300 million tentpole release from the most powerful studio in Hollywood, one that was promoted worldwide for years and positioned as a flagship title in Disney's live-action remake strategy. To pretend that financial performance does not matter in this context strains credibility to the breaking point and makes the entire situation look like one giant spiral of denial. And the issues were not limited to audience response after the fact. Red flags had been waving from the very beginning. Long before the movie reached theaters, leaks, promotional stills, and behind-the-scenes footage triggered waves of criticism from fans, industry insiders, and cultural commentators alike. The tone seemed off, the creative direction uncertain, and even neutral observers were puzzled by the choices on display. Matters were only made worse when cast members and the director went on press tours and offered contemptuous remarks about the 1937 original, dismissing the beloved classic that had launched Disney's empire as outdated, irrelevant, or problematic. Instead of building goodwill, these comments alienated core fans, eroded trust, and set the stage for a backlash that grew louder with every passing month. By the time the film finally premiered, the damage had already been done, and Zegler's continued insistence that the world had simply misunderstood her vision only deepened the impression that both she and Disney had lost touch with their audience in the most spectacular way possible. By mocking the very idea of Prince Charming and dismissing it as outdated, Rachel Zegler thought she was striking a blow against antiquated storytelling, but instead she generated more eye rolls than intrigue, giving the impression that she was embarrassed to even be associated with the legacy of Snow White. She distanced herself from the heritage of the story that gave her a career-defining role, and now she seems shocked to discover that audiences did not return her disdain with loyalty. To make matters worse, rather than engaging thoughtfully with those who simply chose not to watch the film, she mocked them, claiming that abstaining from the remake for political or personal reasons was shameful and contrary to the spirit of art. There is a vast difference between disagreeing with critics and slandering ordinary families and parents who just didn't connect with the updated version, yet Zegler blurred that line, painting dissenters as cultural enemies rather than disappointed moviegoers. That is not how one regains public trust, it is how one alienates it even further. Still, Zegler insists that the film was crafted for the contemporary woman, a phrase she repeats with conviction, as though women today were a monolith who all share the same worldview. The flaw in her argument is obvious. Women, like any group, are diverse, with millions of different experiences, values, and beliefs, and no single creative vision can claim to speak on their behalf simply by sprinkling words like empowerment or progress into a rewritten fairy tale. Audiences did not turn away from Snow White because they resented diversity or modern female characters. They turned away because the film felt heavy-handed, disengaged, and disingenuous, more concerned with making statements than telling a story. What viewers encountered was not a magical reimagining but a lecture disguised as a movie, a work so intent on proving its relevance that it forgot to be enjoyable.
It's about to get really annoying on Instagram, and I need you all to know it's because my place is sick.
Meanwhile, Disney finds itself trapped in an awkward limbo. Publicly, the studio cannot openly criticize Zegler without igniting an entirely new firestorm, yet privately, insiders are already whispering that she is unlikely to be trusted with any major projects in the near future. Behind closed doors, there are reports of executives holding meetings and admitting that keeping her at the center of promotion was a mistake, with some acknowledging that her outspoken comments did as much damage as the film's creative missteps. This is no longer just about one box office failure. It is about brand integrity, reputation, and trust with audiences that Disney has spent nearly a century cultivating. Increasingly, Zegler's name is seen as more of a liability than an asset, a reminder of controversy rather than talent. It is not that viewers reject new interpretations or shy away from bold retellings. Audiences have proven time and again that they welcome fresh perspectives when those changes are woven seamlessly into strong storytelling. But when a film exists primarily to deliver a message, when its agenda is louder than its characters, and when viewers feel they are being preached to rather than entertained, the result is rejection. That is precisely what happened here. What makes it even more striking is Zegler's inability, or refusal, to read the room. Instead of stepping back to reflect on what went wrong, she has doubled down, intensifying the very rhetoric that first made audiences uneasy. She has gone so far as to declare that diversity should not merely be a part of storytelling but the entire foundation of it, elevating representation above narrative itself. To many, that stance is not inspiring but alienating, because while audiences want inclusivity, they also want heart, imagination, and magic, and when those elements are sacrificed, no amount of lecturing can fill the void. In Zegler's view, diversity and representation are not just features of storytelling but the very foundation of it, an idea that might sound admirable in principle yet collapses in practice when it comes at the expense of narrative itself. And then came perhaps the most peculiar twist in her entire tirade, her remarks about working with Gal Gadot. With a cryptic comment, "It wasn't what I anticipated, and I'll stop there." She left audiences and reporters raising eyebrows, wondering whether there had been tension on set, disagreements about the direction of the film, or deeper conflicts lurking beneath the surface. The phrasing suggested she was holding back, resisting the urge to throw someone else under the bus, at least for now. On its own, such a remark might have been insignificant, but combined with her refusal to back down from controversy, it only added more fuel to an already raging fire. What makes this saga so extraordinary is that it has very little to do with politics or diversity initiatives themselves, and everything to do with what happens when a celebrity refuses to acknowledge that perhaps, just perhaps, the project failed on its own terms. The aftermath of Snow White has become more than a dent in Rachel Zegler's ego. It has become a textbook example of how not to manage public perception after a disaster. Most actors in her position would have stepped aside, distanced themselves from the debate, waited out the storm in silence, and rebuilt their careers slowly, allowing time and new roles to shift the narrative. Zegler, by contrast, grabbed a flamethrower, charging into every criticism with counterattacks, portraying herself as the misunderstood revolutionary at the center of a cultural uprising that never actually happened. What should have been a forgettable flop is now remembered as a chaotic PR implosion that left her more isolated than before. Behind the scenes, studios have cooled considerably, not always because of her talent. By most accounts she is gifted and has screen presence, but because the optics around her have shifted dramatically. In Hollywood, perception is everything, and no studio wants to risk a $100 million production on a lead actress who might alienate half the potential press tour audience before the film even opens. This is not speculation. The trajectory of her career already shows the consequences. Her next confirmed role is not a studio tentpole but a modest independent project with a small budget, limited promotion, no major gala premieres, and barely a whisper of anticipation. For someone once hailed as the face of young Hollywood, it represents a sharp and rapid decline. Just a few years ago, she had the breakout performance, the voice, and the look, with her West Side Story moment positioning her as a rising star destined for longevity. But that promising image eroded quickly as her interviews circulated widely, portraying her as dismissive of beloved content and contemptuous of the stories that audiences hold close to their childhoods. She did not come across as a fearless reformer or a bold visionary, but instead as someone scolding viewers for loving the wrong things, lecturing them while dismantling the magic they came to see. Once the dominant perception becomes that people are tired of hearing from you, recovery is exceedingly difficult. That is the atmosphere surrounding Zegler now. Every statement she makes feels like gasoline poured onto the very fire that studios are desperately trying to extinguish. Her latest declarations that diversity, equity, and inclusion should not merely guide art but serve as its sole purpose landed less like a noble manifesto and more like a proclamation that films must operate as lectures first and entertainment second. This framing does not resonate with audiences who are hungry for compelling stories, relatable characters, and emotional journeys. It leaves them feeling preached to rather than transported. Disney, for its part, is working frantically to move on, sweeping the wreckage of the Snow White project under the rug while diverting all energy and attention to future releases. The company's silence speaks volumes, signaling both their desire to bury the controversy and their determination never to repeat such a fiasco again. Disney now seems determined to distance itself from Snow White as much as possible, almost as though the film has become a quiet embarrassment rather than a flagship release. The official social media pages rarely reference it. The promotional campaign that would normally surround a Disney Plus debut has been reduced to almost nothing, and industry insiders are already noting the absence of the usual interviews, trailers, press junkets, and gala events. What might once have been touted as a proud reimagining of a Disney classic is instead being maneuvered toward a low-key release at the end of June, the kind of release pattern usually reserved for projects the studio hopes will fade quickly from memory. Behind closed doors, executives are reportedly unsettled, with Bob Iger himself said to be revisiting how such high-profile projects ever received approval in the first place. The scars left by Snow White and other recent misfires run deep. Expensive productions that, rather than delighting audiences, ended up alienating them by placing lectures and cultural commentary above the joy of storytelling. For years, Disney thrived on its reputation for magic and universal appeal, producing films that brought families together across cultures and generations. But when those same films began to feel more like sermons than stories, audiences pushed back, not necessarily against diversity or inclusion, but against the sense that entertainment had been replaced by ideology. This realization is beginning to reshape Disney's internal priorities. Executives are now said to be focusing more heavily on ensuring that future films, regardless of how modern or diverse they aim to be, actually connect with audiences in ways that feel organic, engaging, and fun, rather than confrontational or overly didactic. The lesson, which the company seems to be slowly learning, is that authentic representation works best when it flows naturally from well-developed characters and strong writing, not when it is shoehorned into the narrative as the sole purpose of the project. Meanwhile, Rachel Zegler continues to take an entirely different path. Instead of softening her stance, acknowledging missteps, or showing humility, she has doubled down again and again, repeating in her latest remarks that she will stand by her interpretation of Snow White forever, even going so far as to say that audiences simply were not ready for it. That single statement went viral, quickly becoming a meme and fueling even more ridicule, as critics compared it to the stereotypical excuse of an artist insisting, "You just don't understand my art." Such remarks did little to improve her reputation and instead reinforced the perception that she was out of touch with her audience and unable to read the room. What frustrates many observers is not that Zegler took risks or wanted to reimagine the character, but that she framed criticism as ignorance or prejudice rather than recognizing that the problem was a failure of execution. Audiences were never inherently opposed to a modern take on Snow White. In fact, there was tremendous potential to present a refreshed, relevant version of the fairy tale that honored its roots while adding new dimensions. But instead of offering a story that invited audiences in, the film delivered one that felt overbearing, as though proving a cultural point mattered more than creating wonder, heart, or timeless appeal. The result was a movie that satisfied no one. Longtime fans of the original saw little of what they cherished, families seeking charm found none, and newcomers hoping for originality received only a heavy-handed lecture disguised as a fairy tale. This disconnect might have been repairable had Zegler chosen to respond differently. Had she met the backlash with humility, acknowledging that the movie may have missed the mark and expressing a genuine desire to learn from the experience, the narrative surrounding her could have shifted. Hollywood, after all, is remarkably forgiving of failure. Some of the most celebrated actors and filmmakers today are those who once faced major setbacks but showed grace under fire, took responsibility, and reinvented themselves. Instead, Zegler has consistently chosen to escalate. Her refusal to show even the slightest bit of self-awareness has not only made reconciliation with audiences more difficult, it has also threatened her career prospects. The entertainment industry moves quickly, and every year new talents emerge hungry for the spotlight. If Zegler cannot rebuild trust, she risks being remembered not for her breakout in West Side Story or her undeniable talent, but for a moment in which she appeared to turn against the very audience she needed to win over. In Hollywood, box office bombs can be forgiven, but arrogance in the face of widespread criticism is much harder to overlook. As Snow White approaches its quiet Disney Plus debut, the legacy it leaves behind is already taking shape, and it is not one that the studio or its star would have hoped for. The film will not be remembered for its visuals, its cast, or even its controversial creative choices. Instead, it is becoming a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when a studio misreads its audience, when a performer misreads the cultural mood, and when a beloved fairy tale is stripped of its timeless magic in an attempt to turn it into a manifesto. For Disney, it is a reminder of the delicate balance between progress and preservation, between updating stories for new generations and respecting the emotional connections audiences have to the old ones. For Zegler, it is a hard lesson in the dangers of doubling down when humility might have salvaged sympathy. And for Hollywood as a whole, it serves as a warning that viewers do not reject change itself. They reject being talked down to, patronized, or treated as though entertainment must serve as a lecture. If there is any silver lining, it is that the failure of Snow White might ultimately guide future projects toward a healthier blend of creativity, representation, and storytelling. But in the meantime, what should have been a triumph has instead become a textbook example of how magic can evaporate when a fairy tale loses sight of what made it enchanting in the first place.